Today we're going to begin by painting in our final flamingo, and I just want to reiterate the importance of always practicing. I'm so much happier with my second attempt at the flamingos than my first attempt, so that's why it's always good to practice. The colors that we're going to need today are the same colors we used yesterday. So for this middle one, we need to mix equal proportions of the deep crimson and magenta. This is our tone of our pink hue. So to create this tone, you mix equal proportions of deep crimson, magenta, and then a little bit of the burnt sienna. This other color is a tint of our pink hue. To create this, we mixed equal proportions of deep crimson, magenta, and then added water to create a light value. As always, have a nice bucket of clean water handy that you can use to create your variegated wet on wet wash. Use your rounded brush, and same thing as before, analyze your photo of the flamingo to see where your highlights are. We have white highlights on the top portion of the body, so I'm not going to put any water there as I want that part of the body to stay white. Everywhere else though can receive water. And as you paint, make sure you're careful to paint around the eye and the beak. Wherever you put water, that's where your pigment is going to go. As you come to the body and you know that you're going to have to start leaving that white area, you want to make sure that as you're painting in the water, you're painting it in like the little feathers that you're seeing curving around the form to emphasize the three-dimensionality of the form. We don't want our flamingo looking flat, so that's why we want to make sure that every mark that we put on is curving with the form of the flamingo. I'm going to avoid putting water on the legs, but I am going to put it on this little thicker part. You could call it the upper thighs of the flamingo. And I'm going to put it there. Okay, I'm just going to re-wet the neck again and the head. That always seems to get a little dry too fast. And now that I have a nice glistening area on the flamingo, I can start adding in my light value pink. I've tested this pink on my scrap paper before we began, so make sure you always test your colors before you put it on. With variegated washes, the key to having success with it is putting the color down and letting it do its magic by not overworking it. As I paint in this value of this tint, I'm paying attention to where my highlights are. So my highlight is on the left-hand side of this neck, so I'm placing the color on the right-hand side. When I get to the body, I'm putting in this pink in strokes. You can see that my tint for this flamingo is a little bit darker than the tints I was using in my other flamingos. And that's just because this flamingo is a darker pink than the other one. So that's why I made my tint just a little bit darker than the others. So I'm applying this to the underbelly, and see the magic that can happen when you just apply the color and let it flare out. It really does create the illusion of feathers in there. Then I'll apply this to the left-hand side of our leg there, and then the bottom part of this leg. I'll clean off my brush, and now I'm gonna start building up the tones of this flamingo. So I'm gonna go in with this mixture of deep crimson, magenta, and burnt sienna. And as I did on the other flamingos, I'm gonna be painting this in the underbelly of this flamingo, as well as the backhand portion of the tail. I'm skipping a little portion here because this has a little bit of a highlight on the picture, so I don't wanna put a tone there. So everywhere I'm placing this color, I'm trying to be specific. I see a little bit of a coarse shadow in the crease of the neck to where it meets the body, so I'm going to be putting this tone in there. I'm also going to carry this tone down just a little bit further to the right-hand side of the neck to create more of a transition of value. I am seeing this tone on the bottom portion of the neck, so I'm going to be placing it there, just in little tiny dabs. Clean off the brush, drag it dry, and now I can start putting in my more intense colors. So I'm gonna go straight in with the crimson and magenta mixture that was mixed in equal proportion. I'm noticing there's a little speck on the head, a little bit on the neck, definitely here in this core shadow region, and it gets carried down. There's a little bit of a explosion of pink here in the front portion of this wing. And then another explosion of this dark pink in the back here. Once again, I'm letting that color kind of explode on its own to create those really nice transitions. I don't really have these white dots in my reference photo, so I'm just going to take some water and paint into those areas just to get that transition to start happening between those colors. I have a little speck of pink on the back end here that I'm going to place in, as well as on the very back end of this tail. There's some feathering going on, so I'm just going to pull that out just a little bit to add some extra little bits of detail. With that little dark pink there, and where the tones are getting a little bit darker, I'll let those mix together. And there's not too much going on in this detail for any more that I have. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna clean off the brush. I'm gonna start lifting off areas that might have gotten a little dark. So here on this neck, it got a little dark. So I'm going to be cleaning off the brush, wiping it dry, and then lifting off the pigment to create a lighter value on the left-hand side. And this is going to help make my flamingo look more three-dimensional. Also noticing here on the bottom portion of his head, it's a little bit lighter, so I'm just going to lighten it up there as well. I can start lifting off some of these lines of feathers that I'm seeing here on the body. Sometimes I just like to hold the brush down and let it absorb the pigment in that area instead of rubbing it back and forth. And squint your eyes as you look at your flamingo, see what else you can do. I'm noticing that I'm missing my lightest pinks in this back section, so I'm going to make a lighter tint than what I previously made. Going to, sample that on the side there to make sure it's not too dark. And I'm going to use that to paint in a few more feather lines on the right-hand side of this flamingo body. So you can see I had some water that spilled down that I wasn't aware of, and it's actually made my pink go outside of the body. I can try to lift that up with the lift off technique to try to remove some of that extra pigment. You could even take your paper towel and try to lift up some of that pigment in that area. You want to be cautious doing this though, because you don't want to lift up the fibers of the paper too much. I might just have to be okay with there being a little bit of a inconsistency in my painting and not having it be perfect at this point. And that's the thing with watercolor. It's very hard to, clean up mistakes. Mistakes do happen, and so we can try to work with them later on. But for right now, while this paint is still wet, I'm going to try to lift up as much as I can. So I can't really do any more because it's starting to lift up the fibers of the paper. So, it is what it is. I'm not going to stress about it. But what I am going to do is to start building up some of my darker pinks again, now that this is starting to get a little bit more dry. So with my slightly dry, dampened brush, I'm going to go back into my most intense pink that I have here. And I'm just going to build up my core shadows just a little bit more in the darker pink areas to help create this really dark illusion of feathers. And I'll do that one more time with my tones on the underbelly. Don't want to forget about that highlight that I was seeing here, so I'm going to lift off that highlight to show the separation. I'll use my tone again to add in the darker value underneath this leg, as well as putting it in on the left-hand side of that leg. And then I'll just go in with my darker pink one more time to really have that explode out and look really nice and dark. And there we have our third flamingo put in. Next, we're going to be painting in our legs. If you look at the color of the legs in the picture, you'll notice that it most greatly reflects our pure hue of crimson, red, and magenta. But in some areas, it gets to be a darker value where it almost has a more purpley quality. So to create that, we're going to add a little bit of blue into our pigment. Begin by combining crimson red and magenta in equal proportions. Once you have that equal proportion made, I should move this in so you can actually see what I'm mixing. Then you can add in some, ultramarine blue. So we want to use this blue. Remember, ultramarine blue wants to make purple. So that's why we're using this, to just deepen this value a little bit more. You can see how nice and intense that is. It's a little too purple, so I'm going to add in a little bit more crimson red and a little bit more magenta, because we just want a darkened version of this hue. And I'll just slowly add in the ultramarine blue until I get that nice deep color, adding in the magenta and then the dark crimson red to make a really nice deep value. And I'm happy with what I have now. So now I can begin painting in the legs of my flamingos on the right-hand side. Whenever you're painting in the legs, you want to make sure that the tip of this rounded brush is staying nice and tapered. So to ensure that, what you're going to do is when you dip it into your pigment, we're going to start with this pure hue of magenta and alizarin crimson. You want to swirl the brush as you lift it off, and that's going to put a really nice fine tip onto the brush itself. From there, you can very lightly paint in each leg of your flamingo. Be careful not to paint into the form of the other flamingo. Now, while this is still wet, you can go in with your darker value and dab it into the left-hand side to make it a little bit darker. To get the highlight back on the right-hand side, you can lift off the pigment with the brush to get that highlight put back in. And that helps us give a more three-dimensional range of values. We'll do the same thing to the leg that's coming down on the left-hand side. I am gonna have to mix a little bit more of this pink hue though with the deep crimson and magenta. And just make sure that if you also have to remix, that you're remixing this in equal proportions. Okay, once again, I'm gonna twirl my brush to where I make a nice fine point. If it looks too like thick, then you probably have too much water on the brush. So I'm going to just, scrape some of it off, dry off my brush, and that looks a lot better. We're not gonna paint the other leg here because our flamingo is still wet. So we're gonna move on to our two legs on the right flamingo. You'll notice in the reference photo that there is some mud on the legs of this flamingo. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our tone that we previously have mixed, And we're going to add a little bit more burnt sienna to that, as well as a little touch of the yellow ochre that's below and right next to the burnt sienna. I'm gonna go back in with a little bit more burnt sienna in there, and then that is going to help give us that kind of like muddy texture that we're seeing. So what we're going to do to create that transition of color is first we're going to paint in our magenta and crimson mixture. We're gonna be painting in the front leg first. So we'll take our brightest pink hue here, and we're gonna place it about 1/4 of an inch down on the left leg. While that is still wet, we're gonna clean off our brush, move over to our neutral that we've mixed, and we're gonna paint that right in next to it so the two colors will blend since they're still wet. We'll get that nice transition of color. Clean off my brush again, and I'm gonna move back to the pink for like the knobby part of this knee. Clean off my brush again, go back to my neutral color. There's a little bit of this color that's coming in off of the right-hand side here. So I'm gonna put that in. Clean off my brush. I'm gonna go back to my magenta color and paint that in the rest of the way. To help show that transition of value and to make it look more 3D, I'm gonna use the lift off technique first to put in my highlights. So I'm lifting off the pigment on the right-hand side of my legs to get a highlight in there. So I'm gonna do that on the skinnier side here of this leg, which it's a little bit harder to do because the area there is so small. And then to add in that core shadow, let's just take a little bit of that purple, place it on the left-hand side, and then on the left-hand side of the legs on the bottom. Perfect. Now, if this flamingo is dry, we're gonna go back and we're going to paint in the left-hand leg there. This top color is actually just going to be in a shadow, so I'm just gonna go straight in with our cooler pink, which is that purpley mixture. I'm gonna brighten it up with just a touch of our brightest hue pink. Then I'll paint this bright pink hue in the rest of that leg. Being really careful not to paint into my flamingo, and it looks like I might have drawn it a little off here, where these are connections. So I made a tangent by accident, but once again, things happen and I'm just gonna work with it. I can't really erase now, can I? So what I can try to do is maybe lift up that pigment a little bit more on the right-hand side, so it looks like that flamingo is overlapping the leg instead of the leg overlapping the flamingo, because that's gonna look really weird if we don't do that. And there we go, that's starting to look a little bit better. So this is why it's always good to double check your drawing. I did not double check my drawing in this area, so my body overlaps the leg a little bit, and that's okay. But now it looks like it's more accurate. I'm gonna be real cautious when I put in this darker value. I'm only gonna be putting it in the upper portion here, as well as the left-hand side of the leg here. I want to avoid this portion because this is going to be wet and I don't want this darker color kind of seeping into that body. And there we have that back leg. Once this leg is dry, we can put in the other watercolor for that leg, and we're going to repeat the same process. So we will put in the pink, the yellow, then the pink again. Clean off the brush, put put in my yellow where I'm seeing it next. Letting those colors transition into one another. Clean off the brush a second time. Go back in with my pink. Paint in the knob. That little knee area. I'm just using the tips of my bristles here to paint in this shape. Remember to swirl that brush when you lift it off the palette too to help create a nice fine point. I'm going to paint this down all the way into my foot. Even though that foot should be black, I'm going to paint the pink down into the majority of the foot because the pink will kind of peek through some of the black areas there. So it'll give me a nice little base. Next, I'm going to put in my highlights. So here on the knee, it's catching a highlight there that I want to lift off. Remember, with the lift off, you use a clean, damp brush to do that. It's all about patience and not rushing this process. There's a highlight here on the foot that I'm going to lift off as well. And looking for those highlights will just make your flamingo look more three-dimensional. And then I'm going to start dabbing in this darker blue color, or purpley color, excuse me, in the leg. There we have it. Our second leg is done. And now I can start moving on to the other legs. We're going to repeat that same process again. Remix any colors that you're running out of, and then paint those legs in. Once you finish the legs on the flamingo on the left, you can take a picture of your work and submit it into today's assignment.